Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage, the podcast. And today on the show, we're discussing how movies, movie language, and the history and production of cinema can inform your Mage games. My guest today is noted seer of things, Yui. Yui, how you doing?
I'm doing real good. Just came off of seeing the new Top Gun film, so I'm full of the maximum amount of cinema that you can possibly have shoved in your eyeballs via the IMAX screen.
Is it true IMAX, like where they hand you a 400-watt speaker to like point directly at your genitals as it is playing, or is it like the fake one where they just like shove everyone towards the screen 10 feet?
Oh, it's the fake one. Come on, Terry.
Okay.
I'm not that bourgeois.
Philadelphia has the Tuttleman Omniverse Theater where I saw Pacific Rim in it, and you could not, the field of view is such that, and the screen size is such that I could not see the top and bottom of a Jaeger at the same time. And it was just a lot of vertical scrolling, and it is glorious, and you leave the theater absolutely deaf. And for reasons I don't understand, they don't play trailers beforehand for anything at the Franklin Institute, so that's always a little bit weird. So what are kind of your bona fides as a movie person? Do you have a background in it, or are you just an avid moviegoer? How many films do you see something in a year? Do you like talking about it? Just give us a little bit of information about your relationship to movies.
It's been a passion of mine ever since I was a kid, and my dad introduced me to movies like Predator and Alien at the ripe old age of 6. And ever since then, I've been kind of impressed and astonished by the variety of cinema and just everything that's possible out there with what you can do and what you can accomplish and, you know, what people want to do in the first place. Around 5 years ago, I basically decided, oh, you know what? I could just basically become a film critic. I just can go to the, as many movies as I can see in the local theater and come out of that and just give my thoughts on them online and then, write things about it. And I can just do that. I've been doing this for the past 5 years, and I've went from seeing around 300 movies to seeing over 3,000 and try to do, at least one movie a day and, write something about it, write my thoughts, and slowly kind of get better at that task of articulating myself. And, I write things for Letterboxd and Patreon and YouTube. And so when it comes to that, it's just very much a passion that's been with me for so many years now.
Talking about movies, to me, we're talking about like cross modality, where we're switching from one thing to another. And to me, RPGs are kind of sometimes stuck in this place where we have a notion of what storytelling should look like, and we just kind of do that without a huge amount of variety to it. Movies came out of simply filming a play with a fixed camera that was locked in place, and it took us a couple decades to figure out what a movie was capable of doing. A lot of role-playing games presume a linear structure where the action goes from scene to scene. Everything is in real time or slower, and our games, to me, can be much improved by abstracting away boring bits and using film theory to improve things. So I'd like to start with just kind of some film terms and how we can use them in the game. Your action-adventure game may have a theme song, where a more noir type game may have voiceovers and other narrative contrivances that are just kind of associated with it. First one is establishing shot. What's an establishing shot?
An establishing shot in cinematic terms is where you point the camera at a space that you want the audience to be contextualized to be the space that things are going to occur in, right? So if you're making a Western, your establishing shot of a scene is a saloon or the desert landscape or, the Rocky Mountains or whatever. You're showing the audience, hey, this is the context, and here's the situation, and here's the particulars of it.
And in a game, to me, I think the establishing shot is pretty powerful. Usually it is a comparatively wide shot. The space itself is kind of what we're focusing on, more so than any characters or what have you. If your characters are about to have a syndicate board presentation or go before a tribunal, I think it makes sense to narrate an establishing shot. The room in Horizon that will hold your fate holds the weight of 500 years of accumulated history seemingly hanging in the air. Wood from extinct trees, painted with paints using pigments that do not exist of this realm, line the wall where the justices will sit in judgment of your fate. And I think it gives you kind of a clear mental image of what could happen, or at least assists with it. It gives us a sense that there is a place before and after the characters engage with it. And to me, this is very important, especially in games where you're dealing with nodes and reality zones where the place itself can almost be a character. The next one I have is cross-cutting. What is cross-cutting?
Cross-cutting is the use of editing to juxtapose two alternate scenes together and to play them out, usually concurrently with each other. So you'll have, one thing going on in a different location, another thing will going on in a different, somewhere like miles away, minutes away, whatever. You're cutting across, time and space, but you're presenting them as one after the other and kind of collapsing those emotions into the same thing.
And this kind of relates to another term that I'll kind of talk to together, the Kuleshov effect. What is that?
The Kuleshov effect is another form of editing where you essentially are doing cross-cutting, juxtaposing two seemingly unrelated images, but through the juxtaposition, you're gaining a thematic idea or emotion or meaning, or you're telling a story by contrasting two apparently different things. So cross-cutting, you're just telling two things at the same time. Kuleshov effect is named after an editing pattern where an action takes on a larger thematic meaning, right? So it can go from a person's face kind of having a pretty sneering kind of reaction. And if you juxtapose that with them signing someone's house into foreclosure or them picking up a brand new baby kitten, right? You're going to have, as an audience member and as a viewer, you're going to have a different relationship to that sneering person, right? Depending on what it's juxtaposed with. So it can have a variety of meanings, and you can, feel this this world exploding in front of your face without the director actually having to show that much. It's just, point A, point B, but then you provide the C in between.
And in a game, I could very much see this as a way to humanize or dehumanize a character that you're encountering. For instance, you are being pursued by a black suit, and as you're going with each beat of that chase, the storyteller cuts something in to either humanize or dehumanize it. So they are chasing you down a narrow alleyway, just absolutely bolting. You are trying to keep ahead. And the storyteller cuts in them doing something very similar, of them chasing down their child who is running away from them, giggling, and the parent is yelling like, come back here. And back to our game, the same thing is happening. One of the recurring themes is, if you're going to use a filmic setup, it is frequently the case that it is for the players and not the characters. So you need a game that will accommodate that. Some players are very uncomfortable with the idea of storytellers giving them any information their character wouldn't have. And we'll talk about stance theory in a little bit. But once we free ourselves from that, we can use a lot of these techniques and setups to give something to the eye of the player. What is a bird's eye view or crane shot?
Bird's eye view or crane shot is simply a matter of perspective, where you're taking the camera and you're using it essentially to gain a perspective that's usually not accessible to the average person unless they're in kind of a weird location. So you're providing usually a semblance of objectivity to a scene, right? So if, like a crane, like a movie crane is this big mechanical apparatus. And if you got the camera attached to it, you're essentially, putting the camera in a non-human position, kind of a God's eye view. And, if you're panning over like a town or some kind of object or whatever, then you're definitely, from that vantage point, you're providing a sense of context that isn't just an establishing shot, but can also take you out of a subjective point of view in the movie and provide clarity in a scene.
And to me, one of the powerful things about a bird's eye view is generally they are somewhat fast, in the sense that this is not always a long lingering shot. It is just something that kind of gives you a sense of scale. So your characters are entering a steel foundry, and from their perspective, they see the front of the building, which may seem large and imposing, but they don't have a full idea of how large it is. So introducing a bird's eye view or a crane shot, where it essentially says the camera pans over the hundreds of acres that this facility fully encompasses, and your characters get a sense of its enormous size, that once they enter here, they're practically entering a new world. That is something that you can say, but to me, rather than just communicating this vague feeling that a character would have, providing that filmic explanation for some tables will be more immersive. Other people will kind of find it annoying. The next one I have is a needle drop. What is a needle drop?
Yeah, needle drop is just essentially playing a piece of music that is not explicitly made for the movie. So as opposed to score, right, which is made by a composer, a needle drop is saying, okay, here's this pop song. We're going to put it in here because I feel in some way or other it fits the scene. And if you're a GM or storyteller doing this, I would say this is an essential tool in your tool belt if you're going to be running something that does have that perspective of like usually is discussing a particular theme. So if you open a game with a particular song, that's what a needle drop is, right? And depending on how frequently or infrequently you want to use them really makes a huge difference in games that I find, because music in film is ambience usually with score, whereas with needle drop, it's often used in the way of montage or, kind of a propulsive way of engaging with the scene.
And this is also useful because your game may, for instance, have a theme song, and you can have a running idea that our goal is to include that diegetically within the game periodically. This is something at our tables where we can literally play the song, but it is frequently the case that, I don't know about you, but I hear music constantly out in the world, and somehow in the world of darkness, that is never actually specifically stated. So to me, it is adding realism to be like, this is the music that is occurring in this scene. Music in games to me is hard to do. People have a tendency to play a song.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. So it is not uncommon for me to have a 15-second snippet or something that I then fade down. There is almost no umbral court to me that should not have an accompanying musical tag of between 10 and 30 seconds. And playing that while describing it to me is reasonably powerful to give you a sense of the space. Realize that it can both be something that you use at a table to set mood and something that exists in your game world. The next one I have is Mise-en-scène. What is that?
Mise-en-scène is a much abused word in the film landscape that essentially just means composition. It's how things are arrayed with what you're portraying, how many elements there are, how they're arranged within each other within the space of the frame of the film camera. The arrangement of that, but also, how they're made apparent to us, right? So, filming a coffee cup from 17 different angles is going to make you feel differently about what that coffee cup is or where it is within the relationship of the movie. For storytelling, I'm definitely of the opinion that if you're going to use a concept like mise-en-scène, essentially what this means is control. It's control of how many NPCs are in a scene, of how much description you're putting out, how little description, what music tracks are being played, what players are in a scene, which players aren't in a scene, and who's talking, who's not talking. It's making a decision of, okay, what am I actually going to focus on? Doing that as a storyteller, it's a constant push and pull relationship. And it's not like in a film where, you put it in front of the camera and it mostly stays there, right? Like it's exactly what you want it to be. In GMing and storytelling, it's a negotiation, I find it best. And it's probably, I would say, the most essential part of the game is just making those tiny choices on a case-by-case basis of, does this person have to be here in this scene, or does this element have to be there? It's the Chekhov's, gun thing, right? If you put a void engineer, void ship in the hangar bay of this technocracy amalgam, sooner or later your players are going to be like, what's that void ship doing there? Maybe we should do something with it, right? That's mise-en-scène. That's, okay, you took an element, you put it there, now it has to serve some function, right? Everything that you put in the center of the attention of the players has to serve some function.
I like the idea of Chekhov's void ship. I would like that to formally enter the canon of Mage. The thing to me about mise-en-scène is that it gives a good list. I think that there are presumptions made about how the world is presented, that frequently a storyteller will describe the people. If you are lucky, you will get a physical description. If you are luckier still, you will get some information about posture. But I almost never get information about all the other elements. How is the scene lit? What is the spatial relationship between elements? If we don't care what the objects are, what is kind of the white space and the black space of that scene? How are things colored? What is the perspective of the character? We tend to either get these omniscient views of what is happening in a room or a place, or just what the characters see. There's a sense of framing and composition that you can add. The clutter of props that may be in a hermetic laboratory versus a poetry recital that a postmodern romantic is doing in a graveyard. Don't hesitate to list out these things. There's a way to do it such that it is obvious that it is scene and setting, and that not everything listed is kind of important. And I am perfectly comfortable as a storyteller pointing directly at that and saying, not everything in this scene is important, but these are the things that you see. It is important to me to indicate the color quality and direction of the light. I feel that is one of those things that can very quickly establish the tone of a game. The differences between a sodium vapor bulb cutting through fog, shining down on a meeting that is happening in a empty parking lot versus the greenish hum of fluorescent light bulbs as you go through the seemingly endless corridors of where this office warren meets up with the paths of the wick to become the null zone. That light quality is an important thing to me. So if you're a storyteller, I would look up one or two things on the elements of mise-en-scène and just be like, hey, are there any of these that I can sprinkle in? And at least for me, when I started doing that, I felt that my descriptions got a lot better.
If you're describing a Hermetics library, right, and the players walk in and they're like, okay, we're here to do something, da-da-da-da-da. Yes, it's in theory a good idea to, be like, oh, I want to add flavor. Here's all the names of the different books on the shelves, and here's the little, baby wyvern, in a cage, and here's the candles that are lit in a specific way. That's all great. That's awesome. That's a writerly impulse. You are writing that scene, and that's good. Part of GMing is fundamentally on some level writing, but you need to realize that when the players go into that scene and they go in with one purpose, and then suddenly you hit them with a face full of, oh yeah, here's all these, here's, Mordecaiden's mystical wristwatch, in a glass case, and you have no idea what that fundamentally is. You just added that for flavor. 9 times out of 10, I will tell you, the players will fixate, at least one of them, will fixate on one of those objects, and they will say, oh, what's this? This seems like a story, or seems like some kind of plot hook that the GM is throwing at me, because why else would they include it? So when we're talking about Chekhov's void ship, nothing wrong with that, right? You need to understand that that's something you're leaving in the hands of the players. You're not having control of that. Because once they follow that, you have to follow it up. You can't be like, oh, well, actually, it's not important, and I just described it for the hell of it, because to me, that's a cop-out. You can't be doing that. So just when you loosen the slack on the description, and when you portray something that's not necessarily necessary, do it at your own peril, but also at your own benefit. It's a give and take thing.
And I am perfectly comfortable indicating that something is not important. I very rarely have dinguses in my game. I very rarely have red herrings in my game. The nature of my play is I'm playing once or twice a month if I'm lucky, and I just don't have time with that. So it is not uncommon for me to say, hey, what is your goal in this scene? To establish it, and then to run through it from there with the presumption that that is all that will be done. So pre-conversation, player expectations. What's a montage, Yui?
It provides you with a wide degree of sensation via the editing pattern that's not necessarily spatially related, but you're engaging with the Kuleshov effect to a massive degree, where you're associating a rocket ship with a band singing a song about love or something. It's that kind of effect that can be achieved just by really having an intense editing rhythm. Some films are edited entirely according to montage patterns, and there's just nothing outside of the montage, like the films of Tony Scott. So when you have a montage, it's often, nowadays it's specifically accompanied by like, oh, here's where the music plays. Sometimes montage sequences can just be, different bits of information layered on top of each other.
And to me, the montage is important because it allows us to depart from a one-to-one action of reality versus what we have happening in our game. A montage allows for a lot of narrative compression. A montage can span minutes, seconds, years, or decades. And I think in Mage, we need to be
bridging time.
Yeah, we need to be perfectly comfortable to pull that off the shelf to say, hey, we're going to have 7 months pass by in the next 5 minutes. Every one of you gets one scene as a stand-in for what you were doing during that time. And I think it is remarkably powerful, and I strongly recommend tables use montages when dealing with downtime or a whole bunch of characters acting at the same time. The other thing that Yui's brought up a couple times is the idea of cuts, cross-cutting, interleaving, is moving action back and forth. It is pretty common to switch around the narrative focus. Sometimes I am at a table where there's two different groups of people who are doing different things in different locations, and they just we're going to deal with the people doing the bank vault break-in until completion, and then over here we're going to cut to the people who are we're going to, once that is done, have the people who are engaged in building an escape vehicle do their thing. I generally find it much more interesting to cut between the two where possible. And one of the things that at least I feel I have developed as a storyteller is we can take advantage of the presumption that if a cut occurs that the things are somehow related, or that they are just close enough that we think about them both at the same time, to kind of create parallels in games. You have characters breaking into a bank vault contemporaneously. You have someone trying to convince someone else to join your chantry. In a way, both of them are trying to break into something or trying to get something that isn't necessarily theirs. And I think those kind of implied parallels can be pretty powerful and interesting in a game. Mind you, it can it can also work the opposite accidentally.
Yeah, and those parallels, I mean, that's the Kuleshov effect. That's exactly what it is. That's in, the end of The Godfather 1, where, he's having his child baptized, but then also having all his enemies killed, and it's constantly going back and forth between them in the montage. Like, you're creating a thematic idea out of two things that would apparently otherwise not necessarily be related.
And sometimes in a montage, if I want to build tension, I will introduce montage scenes that do not involve the characters. If the alarm goes off, I think it is important to cut away to the security guard who taps the screen and maybe goes back to sleep for another 5 minutes before catching some element in a view screen that indicates, maybe I have to do something. What is shot reverse shot?
Shot reverse shot is just a simple way of covering a conversation. So you're taking two conversants and having them, the camera be on one, and then when the other person's talking, or you want to cut to the other person, reacting to what the other person's saying, A is talking, and then you switch to B, who then says a response, and vice versa, some variation thereof. In terms of GMing and storytelling, I would definitely just say that shot reverse shot is like a very efficient way of covering a conversation, just so like everything is very contained, everything is, only one person is in focus.
One of the important things for shot reverse shot is, one, it frequently can break the idea of directionality, that elements on one side of the screen are associated with one thing and elements on the other side of the screen are associated with something else. Like if we were to just film two people in profiling conversation. In RPGs, this is powerful for me because the characters are obviously the main characters in their own story, but I think doing shot reverse shot and describing it as such in games reminds you that NPCs and antagonists are their own protagonists. So when we do shot reverse shot, we get the obvious view of going back to the Hermetic laboratory, the characters sitting down at this desk and talking to this Bonnie Sages character, and you see the array of books behind them. But when we go to reverse shot, it gives us a way of showing what the NPC is seeing. So we cut to the NPC's view, and you see three haggard characters who aren't even at the adept level, who have just come in out of the rain, who don't have sufficient mastery of forces to keep themselves dry. They have tracked mud in. They didn't have overshoes or Wellingtons to go with it. One of them is carrying a raven familiar. It allows you to remind the players of what they look like. And I think that is powerful to say, this is how the NPC sees you. The next one I have are kind of like theories of film, and they are realism, classicism, and formalism. What are they?
Essentially, three different theoretical approaches that you can use, and not just for film. Realism is the idea that a film should represent reality in some form or another. That is a very vague idea. It is an idea that I have a lot of contentions with, in as much as we're talking about, whose reality. And in regards to Mage, whose reality is a very, very, very important question, because realism in a game of technocrats is very different from realism in a game of hollow ones. Realism in the guise of film is usually applied to, nothing ideally should be achieved with the editing or camera movement that cannot be achieved via a human being having a perspective in the scene. It's a very anthropocentric idea of what film language should constitute. And so when you're having realism in a game, ideally what you're meaning is subjectivism, where everything, like, if you set a game in a realistic pattern, this doesn't mean that things are grounded and they're just commonsensical. Again, if you have that amalgam, they exist in a reality that makes sense to them. Everything is oriented around their fundamental assumptions, right? So a realistic technocracy game, according to their paradigm, all the traditionalists are, raving lunatics, and the marauders are even more raving and even more lunatic. And it comes with a set of assumptions on technocratic agents are fundamentally right. Here's their reality. I would say the realistic formulation would be you're not abolishing a sense of time or space too much. You're not cutting between two locations very heavily. Things are almost continuous, right? You're trying to avoid actually engaging with the artifice of the cinematic apparatus. And so when you apply that to a game, in storytelling, you're trying to minimize yourself, essentially what that is. You're trying to abstract yourself as much as possible from the game and make it seem intuitive and just like everything is happening in the world instead of as you're in position. Classicism is essentially what we think of as the Hollywood mode of storytelling. It's not like film to theater, right? Like film to theater, in a sense, is realism because you're not broaching anything with, trickery. Like what you see is what you get. Classicism is you're still telling the same narrative, right? There's nothing, that different about it. But as an approach, you're more or less free to take a subjective point of view with the camera. So you're not going into it being like, oh, well, the camera has to be locked in this position because this is where a real life person will be able to see these events, right? Now, with classicism, you bring in the cranes, you bring in the fades, the dissolves, the special effects, the kind of the glitzy artifice that Hollywood, and especially in the golden age, it was known for, where, it's reality, but it's larger than life. It's a bit kind of glammed up and, outsized, and things are exaggerated slightly, but that's to communicate a larger than life effect, right? In classicism, now the camera's moving around, and say when a character sits up off a desk or a bench, the camera moves with them, right? If they're the protagonist, the camera follows them around. When, they enter into a door, there's an edit, and then suddenly they enter into another place. Now we're taking the subjective aspects of the camera and using that as a strength to tell stories. When you use that in a game, that's when, as a GM, now you can start incorporating things that are like, and people don't want to talk about this, but the GM fundamentally does impose their own viewpoint and their own will. The GM is a player. If you're storytelling, you're a player, whether you like it or not. And you're playing NPCs, you're describing things in a certain way that when, there's no objective way that you can write a description. You're describing it from your own point of view. Instead of, Carol walking down the stairs, she gracefully descends the stairs. You're adding these subjective flourishes. You're getting away from the minimalism of the realistic approach, and you're indulging in a heightened aspect.
It seems to me that kind of our default is that we run realist games, which to me is a little bit ironic with Mage, in that the question is like, what is the truth that is being told? And that maybe a lot of the things that we're discussing are how to introduce something closer to a Hollywood perspective or more classical or classicistic way of doing it. Then what is formalism?
The previous two modes were fundamentally about portraying a narrative, right? We're telling a story. That is the prime mode of, we're debating on how to do it, whether we want to embrace the artifice or reject the artifice. But that's, we're still fundamentally in the mode of, okay, this happens, and we're interested in those particular effects. Formalism in film is you're taking almost an exclusive focus on the technical aspects of a movie. So you're paying very much attention to, the music, the sound, the set design, how things are edited, where they're edited. So it no longer becomes the narrative is king, where like I write a script and I have to just film the script as it says to be, filmed, right? With a formalist approach to understanding how movies are produced, it's no longer just we do this for like a straight up communicative effect. Now it becomes what instance of technical observation and that artifice can serve as the point of the exercise itself when making a movie. So the lighting now becomes, take the example of The Godfather, right? That story is, mostly pretty close to the book it's based on, right? That's a literary artifact. What the book doesn't have is the extremely, extremely dark shadows and lighting that the movie has done by Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, where people's eyes are like these tiny glints in this immense series of shadows and blotches and hazy smoking rooms where these backdeal mob stories are told. That is a formalist approach where now we're just taking the layer of artifice and now that becomes its own end, and you're essentially allowing that to more or less specialize itself into its own little corner. So with storytelling, I think this approach is, are you going to have really flowery descriptions of locations? Are you going to, not have, extremely flowery, but, kind of pared back and almost two-fisted, I would almost like Hemingway-esque descriptions of things? Are your NPCs, are they all going to, fit a certain theme? Are they all going to communicate the same idea when you're creating them? That's like, it's all verbena chronicle, right? Suddenly a formalist approach is okay, every element needs to correspond to something about the verbena. If we have plants, we have themes about life, we have characters dealing with topics that the verbena traditionally associated with dealing with, and we have ecological themes and all this. So now it's no longer just, oh, here's the story about these people. Now it's, here's a theme, here's a concept in the formalist approach to storytelling, here's the grand notion, here's the techniques I use to communicate that with, and then here's the story that goes on within that giant compositional structure.
And this is something where I would probably use the term stylized, where it is something where one chooses whether or not the characters are maybe aware of these, but it is also, again, something that is being played up theoretically for the players. When you talk about the dark, brooding lighting that is shining on the mafioso who is bargaining away their tasks for the magically enhanced cocaine you have created, when they're wearing that bright pinstripe suit and the street light is hitting them just so, this is one of those things where you get to choose, do we want that kind of game or not? And I think taking it from an unconscious choice where you just kind of have this model and default to something that is more selected is something that can potentially improve your game. And kind of the last one for me is, what is auteur theory?
So auteur theory, this was originally the auteur approach or the auteur method, I forget, originated in the 1950s and 60s by a film journal called Cahiers du Cinéma, who produced filmmakers like Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, very seminal French filmmakers. And they got started as critics. And, they looked at like the classical way of analyzing a movie, right? Where it was, okay, you have, everyone has their own distinct little parts. Everyone does a single job, right? The actors act, the cinematographer lights, and then the director moves the camera and then does this, and the editor edits, producer produces. It's an assembly line essentially, right? It's the factory Fordian approach developed in like the early 20th century capitalist model applied to artistic cinema. And in the classical Hollywood model, that's what was kind of assumed is like, okay, it's not really the result of any one person's singular thing. It's everyone is making these tiny little choices and movements. And if anything, the producer was the kind of the shepherd of everything, the person who was putting money behind it because they were getting everyone paid, right? The auteur theory was created essentially to argue that actually the director of the film is the person who essentially sets the tone and the ideas and everything that's important about what the film is going to be. And this notion was picked up by American film critics like Andrew Sarris. And Andrew Sarris was read by people like Francis Ford Coppola and Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, and his influence in, what is an auteur, right? Like, what is an author in movies? Like a singular author. Like, when you read a book, right, it has one author usually. Like people, maybe they edit it, maybe there's typesetting, but one person wrote the words, right? And their task was to say, okay, who is the author for a movie? And they settled on the idea of the director as being the kind of person who funnily makes the real choices that have the most outsized effect on what the end artistic product is.
And this is kind of interesting because it asks the question, so who is in control of a game? And frequently the answer given is the storyteller or the players or some mix. But again, this is one of those cases where making it an explicit choice, I think, is important. Sometimes I go out and say, hey, I have a very specific idea for a game with theme and mood. Are players interested? In other cases, the players take control and it's just kind of this madcap sandbox game. And again, I'm not proposing that people try and be auteurs at their table, but just a specific discussion of who is supposed to bring what to the table, I think can really improve a game. And that's kind of why I wanted this commentary on this idea in film of who is in charge or who is responsible.
This is a massively debated notion in anything having to do with film. The idea that, films being the compositions of so many sets of, talents of, stunt people and musicians and caterers and everyone, like these are massive industrial productions. And so the idea of saying, well, actually this one person is really the most important part is controversial, to say the least. But it's also the reason why we talk about guys like Steven Spielberg, because before Steven Spielberg, similar directors like him kind of, really took this notion to heart. Back in the old Hollywood days, even to a large degree now, no one really cared about who the director was. They were here to see the movie. They were here to see the star, right? Maybe the writer. Maybe if you like the book the movie was based on, right? If you like Gone with the Wind, the book, here's the movie, right? That was the idea. Like the idea of the director was this nebulous kind of shadowy figure and behind the scenes that, wasn't really understood by the film public to be that important. When applying this to storytelling, this is an extremely, I would say, I don't even think we're at a position of truly understanding how to even approach this, but some sketches towards the idea, I would say, if you're a storyteller, if you're a GM, you cannot be a tyrant. You cannot do the film director thing if you want to model yourself after that of, commanding people what to do and telling them that this is what's going to happen. If you come up with a great idea for a game and you propose it to your players, that's awesome. Keep in mind that they are composing that game just as much as you are, and they can add things that are unconventional and unsuspected, and things, honestly, that are better than whatever ideas you had. If you're taking a cinematic viewpoint, your players are your stars. And your stars are going to, they're there for a purpose, but also they're there to do what they want to do.
Yeah, generally for me, it's a case where the storyteller has the power to dictate conflict, but they do not have the power to dictate resolutions in most cases.
Yeah, they can set up a situation, right? You set up the scenario. You don't control what people do in this scenario.
Moving from that, one of the ideas that I think is also kind of important is something called stance theory. GNS theory was an attempt to kind of typify how role-playing games work. It kind of asks the question of, so what point of view do the players have? And the four basic ones are actor stance, where what a player chooses for their character to do is based on what the character wants and knows. There is very little outside information. You are trying to inhabit a character and figure out what they want. And this is the default for a lot of people to some extent. Beyond this is author stance, which is decided on what the character wants, but retroactively explaining some of it. Author stance, I think, is pretty natural when somebody realizes, hey, my character's not going in a direction I want them to go somewhere else, but I don't want to have some catastrophe befall them, so hey, I'm going to introduce some background information that may redirect where they want to go. Another stance is director stance, which is making decisions affecting the environment instead of the character. And for me as a player, I always want the storyteller to have a little bit of ability to directly nudge the character, and I always want the ability of a player to directly nudge some of the setting. I feel perfectly comfortable describing the look on a character's face if something with a straightforward response kind of occurs, and I want the players to feel comfortable helping me populate the world with elements. Director stance is usually represented by the game master. And the final one is pawn, which is decides what they want for their character without explaining the motivations. And it doesn't necessarily need to make sense. It's just kind of there as a expedient. To me, one of the things is how dogmatic someone wishes to be about actor stance. Some people want to so thoroughly not have their player character experience tainted by outside information that they don't want a description of anything that's happening outside of their immediate sensory range. And to me, in some games, that's just kind of boring. And we lose the ability to do cross-cutting or to do a montage of what the bad guys are doing as something is approached. So one thing to consider is just how do players determine what their character is going to do? And again, make that conversation explosive. Do you have any thoughts on stance before we kind of move on to mechanics?
A really crucial aspect of this is information, about in-character information and out-of-character information, where players, especially, like you said, the more actorly parts of this theory, they want to be so immersed that I don't want to know anything that my character doesn't know. And that's great. And I like the impulse of wanting to immerse yourself in the role, right? That's a good thing. You should encourage that. But also, I think, when you make like an off-color joke about like, oh, there's this element that, so-and-so doesn't know about, or here's a reference to this thing. Those players can get sometimes irrationally upset about that. And you should be aware of that before you go into a game and you kind of act casual about, in-game and out-of-game information. If you want to really adhere to that, if you take that seriously, like, yeah, do it. It's fine. Like, that's, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But like you always say, Terry, expectations should be provided. Everyone should have a consensus on, approach your players with a degree of respect and just say like, all right, what do you want out of this? Like, what are you okay with being privy to this, or are you not? What's your stance? And just get an idea of like what they're going for. And if one player is like, well, you can't bring that up because that's meta gaming. We're also human beings outside of this, right? You're not a performer on theater or in front of a camera who's getting paid to be exclusively within that tiny little provincial space that's provided for them. You're with a bunch of friends. So I would say like, yeah, just have some respect for players and like what they want, because that will go a extremely long way, in my opinion.
To me, it is useful to talk about this in terms of having a reminder to who is the audience. It is we playing with our friends or the other people at the table. Some things get to be for the players, and it doesn't need to always be through the perspective of the character. The character is just kind of our agent in the world in most cases. And by freeing up that assumption, I think you can have a lot of fun, or at least that is something I have found in my games. A separate conversation on whether or not we like stylized games or genre contrivances, but I think, as Yui says, let's have that conversation. And the language of film and the language of game theory allows us to make that explicit. The next thing I have are a bunch of film mechanics in games. Some games use the language of film to create actual mechanics. For instance, a credit scene is a game mechanic whereby the players take turns highlighting what each person did to make the game happen. This is a useful way of saying, this character didn't get a lot of screen time, but the thing they did was absolutely essential. And it's not uncommon while the credits are being showed that you're indicating who was responsible for the movie, as well as having kind of highlight stills on what happened. In some games, this is a way of handing out XP or a way of handing out willpower to be like, oh yeah, you did have that good moment, or you did do that super useful thing. A pair of mechanics I very much like from Pasión de las Pasiones is Next Time On and Last Time On. In Next Time On, the players take turns pitching what they think could happen in the next session. The idea here is in telenovelas, it is not uncommon for the Next Time On to include things that didn't happen or that won't happen. In this case, if something happens roughly as depicted, the characters may receive a bonus. You may just receive the joy of knowing that you predicted something or inspired the storyteller to do something. Last Time On is a way of reminding people what has happened and allows them to highlight what they thought was the most dramatic or impactful bits. This may be something that was not impressive to you, where they bring up the NPC they particularly enjoyed or a moment of tension or drama. If the player focuses on a particular line or a character, that implies that they probably found them interesting. If you want to mechanize this as a way to hand out experience points, willpower, or dice pool bonuses for something, that also is perfectly fine. A game that is highly filmic in terms of its inspiration is City of Mist, and one of the mechanics it has is the voiceover, which this is a noir game, and one of the tenets of the noir genre is characters rarely say directly how they're feeling, but their actions often betray them. So This is an opportunity for a character to share their direct thoughts. It lets you add a character develop moment to the narrative that does not come from interacting with another person. This is very much a case of tell, don't show. And I don't know about anyone else, but I think that is a very useful shortcut in RPGs. When you have the time in writing to figure out how to weave a character moment into a story, that is great, but sometimes you just need to broadcast what you're thinking to get the game moving. And you may be dealing with a genre where the contrivances do not allow a character to directly spout what they're believing. This isn't necessarily a Disney movie where we have an I'm wishing song that kind of establishes the action. This is useful when a game wants your characters to have transparency with the players, but not with other characters, or to just reveal a bit about who your character is that other people may find interesting. To me, this is also very useful in one-shots when you just want to get the action going. We talked about montages. This, to me, fits very well in with downtime extended role mechanics, whereby between sessions, there's a rapid montage of what people have done, spending XP or preparing. This is an opportunity to generate a dice pool. It gives a short micro scene where characters just get to describe things. Generally, there won't necessarily be a roll to see if the action in the montage is effective, but maybe to see how the outcome is. It may give additional opportunity to investigate, to provide a clue, or just to build backstory. Another thing that we can do in film that we can't really do in real life is have a flashback. The current action cuts to a previous time to provide information or context. Some games have this as a mechanic. My go-to for this is going to be Blades in the Dark, or as I need to pronounce it, Blades in the Dark, which has an extensive flashback mechanic that allows you to place in details or attempt to modify the scene as it goes. This is something to me that is useful in Mage to represent the mentor past lives or dream mechanic. This is also something that was done by friend of the show, the writers of the book Assassins, which I think is pretty good. There are also other games that have a meta-narrative bend to them, but that will kind of be outside the context for the purposes of this conversation. Do you have any particular filmic things that you feel should be turned into a mechanic?
For what you mentioned at the top of that list, the kind of the highlight reel of what happened in every game, I think every game should have this. I think if you have the little bit of time that you can provide at the end of a session to say, hey, everyone, like, what do we think was an interesting part of the game? Or like, who did the best role playing or this or that? If you can do that, you immediately create a sense of camaraderie and purpose in the game, because now you have the players reflecting on what they just did and thinking about it. At the end of a session, who's usually like, oh, I have to disengage and now I have to be passive and, okay, well, that was fun. Now it's like, oh, no, but what did you think, right? No longer just, hey, I'm the GM and I'm going to give you a unilateral idea of this happens and this happens and this is the one point of view that matters. Now it's, oh, hey, you matter in this game, right? You're the player. You're acting, around here. You're doing stuff. What do you think mattered in this session? And also, spoiler alert, as a GM, you can just use that to steal from. Like, if players tell you, I liked this, guess what? In the next couple sessions, that thing is probably going to show up again if you're good at your job at all. So it's a great way to hijack your brains of your players and get them to spill the beans on what could make the game better.
And now the last section, which is where I want to plumb Yui's massive understanding of film, is there are frequently ways in which films are listed as inspirations for Mage, and I hate this. Frequently, it depends on you already being familiar with the film to pull the reference that the author makes. M20 is particularly guilty of making references that presume you have already seen the film, making a comparison in such a way that someone who hasn't doesn't gain anything out of it, and not providing enough other information to figure out what it is. So the way this is going to work is we've broken it down into some kind of sections where are we stealing setting, mood, character, or plot? And the idea is, what's the movie? What happens in it? How do we use this in our game? So, for instance, my first one is the movie What Dreams May Come, which has a depiction of heaven as a painting. And for me, this is a case of we are experiencing the domain of Haliara of the Woven Smile, who sits in the court of spring. The spirits move through the air as if painted brushstrokes, and as you step, your feet slip slightly on what is the psychoreactive paint of the place. all of your actions hang as if you were in a flipbook, and you move from gesture to gesture suddenly as if in a low frame rate video game. Trying to move through the court, which only updates at 2 frames per second, is difficult at best, but you quickly find that voice seems to be in real time, allowing you to carry on vocal discourse without much difficulty. What Dreams May Come, for me, I thought was visually beautiful and striking and interesting in terms of how do we depict heaven and a potential hell. Yes, if the list doesn't get too long, I will list all of these as well in the show notes. Do you have a movie that to you inspired setting that you think could be used in a Mage game?
Yes, and when I think of movies, what I like to think of is in terms of what is the basic scenario that allows good role-playing to arise. So when you talked about that, you talked about like, oh, this illustrates this idea really well. When I think about one of John Carpenter's many masterpieces, Assault on Precinct 13, this is a film where you have a very, very simple concept. You have a police station that's about to be decommissioned. There's like only a handful of people left inside, and it is under the target of this, Escape from New York, the Warriors-esque street gang, who then come in and they just lay siege to this kind of decrepit, old and busted police station, and everyone inside basically has to circle the wagons and defend this place. It was inspired by films like Night of the Living Dead, but wanted to place it in like a non-supernatural contemporary setting. With that basic idea, this is an idea that you can use for anything. You can use it for one session, like a one shot, maybe if you're just running like a short convention game or anything like that. Or you can use this as a climax or as this kind of end of session thing. Whatever you want to use this idea for, you have, good guys on the inside of a discrete location and then bad guys on the outside trying to get in and do something. This basic structure is so applicable. And if you watch the movie, you can understand how to navigate that kind of space, right? So if you use a service like Roll20, or if you draw your own maps, or if you just want to use pictures, you can say, all right, this is what this looks like. Here's the space, right? The space that you're in, all the players are in, is going to be a character. And everything on the outside is the mysterious frontier unknown that's trying to intrude on this space. And in doing that, this is a perfect way I found, that you can take players who don't necessarily always create concepts that are the most conducive for each other, a bunch of disparate concepts that don't really make sense to be together in a game. Suddenly, guess what? They're all in the same location, whatever it is, and they have to defend themselves. So even if they dislike each other, even if they have conflicts, they have to essentially find a way to become a group from this external pressure. So many GMs, I think, have trouble, how do I make a game that makes sense for all these different concepts? Do this. Make a scenario like this, where it's very basic, very simple, and it causes relationships between characters to form because they're all stuck in this locale, right? So they all have to talk to each other to help each other interact. And if they're all mages, especially if they're low power kind of, we don't know what we're doing mages, they have to rely on each other to do combined effects and to actually be able to surpass this overwhelming force from the outside that's trying to get in. So watch Assault on Precinct 13, and this is such a beautiful illustration. It's very simple, not very complicated at all, and you can use it for a variety of things in your game.
The next one I have for kind of setting is just the movie Constantine, which I appreciated. It is a Keanu Reeves, Raquel Welch's film where the titular character is a kind of a renegade agent who is familiar with a war that is occurring between heaven and hell, and the movie contains a depiction kind of hell or the Shadowlands and the supernatural. To me, from a setting perspective, the thing I liked about this movie is every supernatural element had a very distinctive visual style to it. When you're dealing with Gabriel or versus one of the demonic forces, there is a very distinct way in which it doesn't do the thing where we're dealing with a Nephandic dark labyrinth. It just has very dark inflected style. You're dealing with dark woods, you're dealing with dark candles, you're dealing with poor illumination. Whereas on the angelic side, you're dealing with something that is almost antiseptic. And to me, I think that we can use this kind of setting and scene to reinforce things about a character. That if someone has Cloak of the Seasons, or if someone has 3 dots of tainted resonance, this should affect the world around them, including what their furniture looks like. Frequently, we talk about the body of an elemental or an Ifrit or a Djinn, and or a Jinn, and we don't have the environment recapitulate who they are. And I think that is important as a way of kind of using other ways to transmit that information. The other thing that lets us do is that lets us have a world with a lot more supernatural elements in it, where it's not so obvious, where you have people that are in human garb, but if you know how to look at the world, you can see all the ways in which they are tipping their hand as to their true element. And if you're sufficiently subtle and it blends in with what a normal mortal would do, it's not one of those things where you're like, oh wow, this guy's obviously a vampire or something like that. Did you have any other setting-inspiring games?
Marimura Oshii's Patlabor 2. You don't need to see the first one, really, or any of the other previous ones to understand what this one's going for. It's a film where the structure of it, I think, is a model for how I think a lot of Mage games should be structured, at least the kind of games that I like to run, where you don't actually have a ton of fireworks. It's a movie where you have it's a universe where, okay, you have these giant robots that are used for, tactical like missions and police action and all this stuff. It's a world where that exists, but it doesn't treat those robots as if they're their own special thing that's the focus of the story. Quite the opposite. The robots actually kind of fade to the background and are only used in the climax already after all the characters have decided, okay, what's this mystery? Who's doing what? What's this political reason? Who are the players in the scenario? Why do they want this? They spend most of the movie as a political thriller. Then, like in the last, 10 to 20 minutes, then they're like, okay, now we know what we want. Now we can exercise and marshal this huge asset that we have towards something that we want. I think a lot of Mage games should play more into the fact that mages, most of the time, aren't going to be popping off effects every 15 seconds. So I think more Mage games could be structured in this way in terms of a setting where it's a setting where you actually have to think about what you want to do before you can do it. And once you do it, right, it doesn't have to be to the climax of your game, right? But the principle of it is that, once you decide, like, all right, this is exactly what we want. We've really thought about this. This is, our political goal, we're going to overthrow this House of the Order of Hermes. If you want to do something like that, the lesson of patience, of really using the setting of Mage and thinking through its implications, of understanding mages are smart. So they're going to be working towards that all the time. And you're not going to just, constantly be doing magic for the sake of doing magic. If you're going to have a big effect, it has to mean something. It has to have a sense in the story that this is important.
The next thing to me is questions of mood. How does the environment inform us of how we should feel about something? And I have just one example of this, and the movie is The Art of Self-Defense, which to me is a inspiration for kind of the ridiculous ways in which people talking about paradigm and chantry politics can come up. This movie is filled with a kind of awkward, stilted dialogue that takes itself very seriously. And all of the characters are both posturing and painfully earnest. At one point, the sensei of a female student says, I realize now that her being a woman will prevent her from ever becoming a man. And it's one of those things where in the moment it is true, but you take a quarter second and you're like, what? And this is something that I could very much see happening in a very large chantry or within your technocratic group, where someone talks about the fact that we are not pure information prevents us from achieving our ultimate form, that of the number 6. And you're like, okay, I followed you, kind of. There's also a back and forth where one of the characters goes, what is your favorite musical style? Adult contemporary? No, it should be metal. Have you ever listened to metal? You mean like hard rock? No, metal is much more aggressive than hard rock. From now on, you listen to metal. And just kind of establishing these masculine tropes. And I think this is a very good rapid-fire way of setting up a caricature which mages can sometimes be. I also kind of like this slightly awkward dialogue, which I think frequently happens in games, especially when you're dealing with something that is not human. If your dialogue with a fire elemental is not a little bit weird, I think you're kind of pulling your punches. It is also useful to kind of take yourself a little bit too seriously with paradigm, for instance, needing to learn the Akashic style of the unbent punch, which you hear as being this legendary destructive thing, but when you actually see it in practice, is just the art of keeping your arms very straight and more or less slapping someone. I think that can generate both moments of humor and moments of, oh no, we're actually playing this weird little game, which I think is also kind of important. So do you have any movies to you that very much convey a sense of mood?
Yes, and for Mage, because it has so much a sense of possibility and openness, I think understanding the extremes of that with these two movies that I picked is important to just get your foot in the door about like, okay, what is actually theoretically possible that I can achieve. Jean-Pierre Melville's Army of Shadows and Choi Hark's Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain are totally different ends of the spectrum of film, but that both could fit within the idea of what Mage is about. Army of Shadows, which is a story about French resistance in World War II, you have the ultimate underdogs against the terrifying, monolith of the Nazi regime, and the resistance fighters have to be extremely cynical and pragmatic, and they live in a world of tough decisions and nothing ever goes their way. And they kind of, even at the end of the film, their idea of victory is just meeting the fascist regime like halfway, right? That's the best they can do. This is the gritty gothic punk that's kind of more Vampire the Masquerade and maybe even Changeling than I would say Mage is usually written as, but it's definitely in that DNA. And I would say if you're playing tradition mages and you really want to lean into that first edition, second edition idea of the technocracy as like they're everywhere, they have eyes, and each facility on cameras, they know all information, they're tracking us, like really lean into the gothic paranoia and like we're the punks against this monolithic system. Watch Army of Shadows. This will show you what that actually looks like, what it is actually like to be the ultimate underdog who cannot catch a break, because it is brutal. And especially if you're low power tradition mages, that's the story. It's the story of resistance. On the other end of the spectrum, Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain by Choi Hark is wacky, insane, just completely bonkers, like ancient Chinese sorcery and people having metaphysical battles with laser blasts and epic sword fights and jumping 100 feet in the air, and like it's a Hong Kong wuxia film that engages with all the essential tropes of that exaggerated kind of storytelling. And Mage, I don't hear a lot of people doing these kind of games, but it's definitely a part of it too. Like the first edition, it has the gritty stuff, but it also has the, oh, we're on Jupiter and we're fighting dinosaurs, and oh, here comes the Cthulhu. Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain is nothing but this vibe. When people fight in Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain, they're fighting over like battling over the spiritual essence of the earth and of time and of history. It's big mage concepts, high level, arch mastery, like kind of stuff that Mage doesn't have a lot of a toolkit for, but when you see it portrayed, you can understand like it's still melodramatic, it's still interesting. It doesn't have to be cartoonish, because the movie does a good job of showing like, no, they're actually battling over ideas that matter, over things that are important. They're just high concept, outsized battles over ideas, but the ideas still matter to people, right?
Now, are these movies where if you don't want to sit down and watch the whole thing, if I pull up some stills on Pinterest, that is going to give me an idea of the aesthetic, or does it really only unwind in the watching?
Oh, I mean, both. Really, if you take a look at a still frame from Army of Shadows or Zoo Warriors, you know exactly what kind of movie it is, because Zoo Warriors is, low angle shots that make everything look big and huge and epic. Army of Shadows is dour, cold, very blue, very melancholy, very French. Yeah, if you look visually just in any way, you'll understand what these approaches are. And that's like kind of the two spectrums of the World of Darkness, the high cosmic and the gothic punk, that I think, if you understand both of those, then you can navigate like, oh, okay, well, maybe I want something in between. And then you can go for that from there.
The next kind of selection I have is characters, and my first one is Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. Anton Chigurh is presented as an utterly remorseless psychopath who, to the point where the Journal of Forensic Scientists labeled him the most realistic depiction of psychopathy in movies. He uses a coin to see if people live or die, kills quite aggressively with a captive bolt rifle, and to me, this is something that we can take just as a character that has succumbed to morbidity and stasis, a amoral assassin that takes jobs and uses a coin flip to determine if someone should be put down. To me, this is kind of interesting, especially if the group has a mage that takes advantage of sortilege or random foci to divine action, and we can have this cut between this character flips a coin to see if someone lives or dies. How is that different from pyretic bone casting to determine if someone is guilty or innocent. And I think that cut between the two is pretty powerful, played by Javier Bardem. One of the worst haircuts in human history, impressively so. What was a character to you that you wanted to take from a movie and put just kind of in a game?
For me, I think I wanted to orient this answer towards players and how they present characters within Mage. I think a lot of it comes down to, oh, well, this is how, my character is, and there's this idea of description and, what you say with your words during the game. But I think players should utilize description more heavily than they do in general. I think the players should take the reins of that storytelling device. And the movie that I think really shows you how you can do this is Raiders of the Lost Ark. Just the opening, 10 to 15 minutes, I forget how long. Just look at the way that Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones is portrayed, what he does. He actually barely says any dialogue. And what you can do in game is having his actions, and then visually they're described to us in the film, and then you can describe them as your character is doing them. So before he goes into this mysterious kind of dark cobwebbed over temple that's, that he's been searching for, trekking through this jungle, this dangerous environment, before he even goes in there, the rest of the crew just kind of wants to, go in there. Oh, let's get it over with. Let's just go. He stops. He picks up like a bunch of sand. And when you watch it the first time, you're like, why is he picking up a whole bunch of sand? He puts it in a little bag, a little pouch on his belt. And you're like, what is that even for? And then later, when he goes into the temple, gets to all these traps, then he sees that the statue is on a pressure plate, that he wants to kind of get the statue, but without moving the sense of pressure on the pressure plate, because he doesn't know what's going to happen when he takes the thing off and what the reaction will be from the rest of the temple. So he takes out the bag of sand, but he doesn't just put it on there. He kind of eyeballs it. He measures the weight with the statue, takes some of the sand out, and then puts it and swaps it on. Now he gets it wrong, right? And he doesn't, the trap still goes off, but that's not the point. If you as a character can describe your actions in a way where it shows your character's intentions in what you're doing, and not through just saying, oh, GM, this is what I want to do. No, just say, my character does this in this particular way, and using that art of description of showing us, not just telling us what you're going to do, that adds so much flavor to the game, unbelievably enriches it. If you can visually tell it to us in our mind's eye, like the way that Steven Spielberg does with Indiana Jones, where you understand, oh, he's intelligent, he's prepared, he understands the scenario he's in, and he's constantly thinking ahead. We just understand it because we see his actions. We're trusting that whatever's being shown to us is important, right? And if you're playing a character, whether it's an NPC or a PC, doing that level of description, of showing intention through action, goes a long way, I think.
And this is something very much where we get to choose the cadence and length of that. This can be how we introduce the characters before our first session, as it were, like during a preamble or what have you. This is something where you can hand it over entirely to the player to just describe a whole bunch of cool actions, or to something where a storyteller can use guided prompts to do this. What is the coolest way in which you showed that you were highly familiar with stone lore? What is the interesting maneuver you did that disabled the guard effortlessly as you were walking in? What is the flourish that indicates that you knew the 127 names of Gilamathica or something like that? And it is something you can very much hand to the player to fill in if they are comfortable with that.
Something to this effect that has always rung true with me is that I think David Mamet, the playwright, said that there's nothing better in a story that we like to see than someone being good at their job. And if you're a mage, you should be good at something. Mages don't live long who don't have a skill with what they're trying to accomplish. So if you're the gothed out hollow one, let's hear about how you're gothed out. Let's hear the makeup routine. Let's hear the choice of music as you roll up in your car. Use the semblance of action to paint us a picture.
The next one I had was the movie Heart Huckabees, and this kind of, to me, gave me the interplay of paradigmic examples of people who believe in something. The movie depicts a person hired as an existential detective to kind of sort out someone else's life. And in the process, they don't have some success. The character who had hired them gets some setbacks, meets this other character that is kind of this nihilist absurdist, and the movie is kind of the interplay between those people advocating for their view of the world, to me, this could turn into a game in that you are contacted by a high-powered sleeper who is seeking spiritual counsel to get advice on ethical action. Maybe it occurs because your character has the cult background and someone thinks that they are particularly clarifying in terms of the way that they live their life. Contemporaneously, a syndicate member, a nefandus, an infernalist, a opposing tradition, a member of a craft, is kind of vying for this person's attention. We now have two mages that are directly opposed to each other, and this is a case where it's probably going to be settled in dialogue as opposed to in magic, because there's just another mage there. And this is a goal to not transmit a paradigm so much as a moral worldview. The idea of there being zealous advocates for a particular way of seeing the world and someone being caught between them is very Mage to me. Were there any other key characters or movie figures that you thought were particularly interesting?
Yes. Michael Mann's Last Mohicans, Wes Studi's portrayal of the First Nations warrior Magua, is my go-to standard for how to do an antagonist. Because this is a movie where Magua, as the antagonist, doesn't really emerge as antagonist until the second half. And that's because he essentially is just as justified in what he does as the main characters. He's acting out of a semblance of revenge, and what he does is brutal and terrible, but he's had brutality inflicted on him in equal turn. And you, at the end of the movie, you cannot even really question what he sought to accomplish because he presents it in such a forceful understanding of his own internal worldview. And I think a lot of people don't know what to do with antagonists. They should not just be a cartoon villain. If you watch Last of the Mohicans, understand that it provides as much to Magua as it does to the main characters. And by giving him that grace and by giving him that storytelling capacity and by saying, no, you're a valid character, it doesn't say that what he does is right, but what it says is this happens on an equal playing field. He's a human being. If your big bad is a nefandus, they should have an idea of what they're doing. Doesn't mean that they have to be like a good person, because that kind of negates the point of them being an antagonist. You should put yourself in their shoes and be like, well, why would I do all these terrible things? And say like, well, if push came to shove and I really felt this and I had this happen to me, watch Last of the Mohicans. He has terrible things happen to him, and that brutality forces him to become a brutal person. That's the source of antagonism, I think, that really drives the heart of that film from something that's just like a fun adventure tale to a good examination of morality.
Whereas, interestingly, I generally take the opposite. I am perfectly comfortable with cartoonish villains because I think one of the important things in Mage is that quiet exists and paradigm is weird. Everyone has their reasons. From the outside, it doesn't seem to make any sense, and sometimes people just look unhinged. I also agree that it's perfectly reasonable to have some quality time in the deep end of that swimming pool.
To that point, actually, I agree with you. What I just want to say is you, the GM, should think about it. Even if the players don't understand that the NPC, the antagonist, has intentions, that they have, a sense of internal life, even if that never comes to the fore with them, you should still understand that this is happening for a reason. It should make sense to you at the very least if you're doing that.
And the last one are plots. Movie plots are notoriously difficult to steal from because, as Yui mentioned earlier, we are not directors. We don't have the ability to dictate how things are going. But to me, they can often give an interesting starting point. And the one I'm thinking of is the movie Stranger Than Fiction, which involves a number of characters that turn out to be kind of characters in someone else's novel. And the question is, how can the person end the novel in such a way that everyone thrives without betraying their artistic integrity, in that this is a writer whose protagonists frequently die. In a game, the characters or someone near them is being narrated by a disembodied voice. This could be a Umbral Lord, a paradox spirit, or they've fallen sway under a potent artifact or wonder. The characters now need to find a way to persuade the author to end the story in a particular way. You may have Lenanon, Lord of Tragedy, who has kind of taken over your characters in some sort of trade or has sway over an avatar or a mortal who is associated with a cult of some sort. And it is not something where you are freeing them from the grasp so much as convincing them to put their artistic work into another direction. It would be reasonable to me to have a 5-dot wonder, a narrative pen of truth or something like that, that tends to create potent entropy effects that cause it to go in a particular direction that is currently in the possession of a sleeper who is trying to establish themselves as a fiction writer, and that is a story that to me you can kind of just dump as a starting point into a game. How about you, Yui?
I think there are several films that do a good job that Mage doesn't always hit the mark on in the prose writing of the books, of showing the contrast between the magical, kind of wackadoo world and the mundane sleeper world. And I think that interaction should happen more, where you shouldn't just have everything be, all right, we're just going to have a fun game in the Umbra, and we're just kind of totally out there and we have no sense of normalcy. That's fun, but there should be an element of like earthly awareness of like, all right, here's like some actual stakes. So George Armitage's Grosse Point Blank from 1996, with John Cusack as the lead titular assassin, he is a character who has basically, for the past 10 years of his life since he graduated high school, has existed in the covert world of government intrigue and assassinations and black ops stuff and mercenary affairs. And so he's basically become kind of a detached, very depressed person. He gets invited to his high school reunion, and the comedy and the interesting dynamics that result from this guy who kills people for a living and is just kind of a psychopath. But then he has to go back to his old town that he left behind a decade ago and say, "Oh, hi, it's nice to see you. How are you doing? Oh, man. Oh, you have kids. That's great." When he has essentially not led any semblance of a normal life. I think this actually shows you a great way to incorporate sleepers into your mage game, which seems like something that would easily fall away from your priorities, where you're like, I want to show the mage stuff in such vivid detail and I want to get into all these factions. Cool, right? We want to do that, but also I think it's things are illustrated through contrasts, all right? You can describe what something truly is by showing its contrast, by showing, all right, this is what this isn't. And by John Cusack's character existing in this kind of mundane, Detroit suburb and having to go back to this life that he left behind, he becomes essentially, it's a fish out of water story, but it's also him bringing all his baggage with him, right? So now, assassins who want to take him out of the picture are following him back to his town and trying to kill him. And he has to kind of hide all this happening while he's still trying to play the idea of normalcy, that he's still a normal guy. So there's these gunfights and explosions happening, but then he has to be like, but let's go to the punch bowl and let's talk about when you stuffed me into that locker and that kind of thing. Take this plot, and this would be inherently funny and interesting in a mage scenario where it's like, yes, I have become a member of House Bonnie Sages, and I have gone to Horizon and I have achieved all these things, and I am a so and so in this sphere and da da da. And then it's like, oh yeah, by the way, like, here's a family reunion, here's a kind of a social function, here's you get invited to a wedding, right, of your sleeper cousin, and he's like, hey, we haven't talked in a while, like, why don't you come over? Then that character and then the players also get involved, the rest of the group, and then it becomes the hermetic mage trying to be like, oh man, in all this time that I've spent trying to learn magic, I've never actually had time for regular human relationships, or falling in love with anyone or doing something like that. And detailing that scenario, what your player is, but then just having that contrast of being like, all right, yes, we can have all these wacky fun things, but now you actually have to understand the reality of sleepers, and you have to bring in all the highfalutin mage stuff into their lives. So they don't know anything about this. Do you inform them? Do you bring them in on this? Do you like keep it from them? The conflict that arises from that really can develop three-dimensional player characters. What actually is the world of darkness? It's not just the supernatural, it's the supernatural contrasted with the normal.
Are there any other films or ideas that you think people should particularly look at, or any other ideas that kind of came up to you as we went through this?
I would just say, as a basic philosophy, if you take inspiration from film at all, understand that the camera's pointed at something because the director thinks it's necessary. If you focus on something in the game, whether as a player or as a GM, it doesn't matter. It should be conceived of by you as necessary. You should really think about, put a lot of thought into, what do I need? What can I cut? You should really understand it like a film. What is a necessary scene? What actually needs to happen for the story I want to tell? if you have like a cool idea for something like, oh, here's a fun side thing, maybe include it, but also really think about, do I actually need this, or would the story be better without it? Take a sense of artistic integrity in what you present, just like a film director does, and your games will be markedly improved because you'll develop a sense of discipline and what you actually want, and you'll understand your own desire better for what you want to portray in the game, whether you're a player or a GM. I would just say for Mage movies that are just in general, like if you want to understand what Mage is, basically, The Matrix, Crow, Dark City, any of the John Wick movies, like if you want to understand the kind of crazy metaphysical stuff that Mage can get into, watch Dark City and you're like, okay, now we're on, we're on cloud nine, a million miles from Earth, and the Earth is flat and who knows what's happening, right? Can shock you out of this kind of mindset of like, I'm a wizard and I, again, I throw a fireball. No, but that's not the foundation. It's the weird, it's the dissonance between, again, reality and your own perspective that Dark City does a really good job of portraying. And The Matrix is The Matrix. I love all those movies, but really the first one is probably the one that, if you just want to see what the technocracy is Agent Smith. If you want to, if you want to see what the traditions are, people like Neo and Trinity and Morpheus, who are, underground resistance fighters, and they're all individualists and this kind of thing. The Crow is a World of Darkness movie, 100%. They constantly reference it in the books, constantly, and for good reason, because it's essentially, when they do a description of what gothic punk is, it's The Crow. It's totally like music video, smoke machines and rain and graveyards and ambience and people wielding two guns and trench coats. It's classic World of Darkness. Even if you don't like that stuff, I would just say watch it just so you have a context of like basically what they were going for in the 90s when they wrote these games originally. The John Wick movies, if you want to show, again, the kind of surreal nature of having these sub-real underground organizations like the traditions and the crafts and everything, if you want to show how they function in broad daylight, or broad nightlight as it were, the John Wick movies show you like societies have their own internal logic. They don't exist in the regular mundane reality, but not even in the sense of like mafia, because in John Wick they're almost like esoteric orders who trade coins and have all these different phrases and have their own like weird organization. So in John Wick, when they talk about the High Table, then you can get to like, that's how they refer to the Horizon Council in Mage. You're trying to exist in this world that has all this treachery and mystery to it. Great, just World of Darkness movie in general, but for Mage, just showing how those organizations function, I think it does a really good job of.
Well, thank you. If people are interested in following your thoughts on movies, where can they do that?
Yeah, you can find me at Comrade Yui, Comrade_Yui on Letterboxd, on Twitter, on Patreon, on YouTube, on all those platforms. You can just search that up and I'll be there. I write about movies, I make videos about movies. I constantly say new stuff, and just in general, I run Mage games on occasion that I do talk about, but in general, when I take inspiration, it's often from what in the last 6 months have I watched that I'm really passionate about, and I say, all right, I don't want to do that, but I want to do something like that.
Well, awesome. Yui, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Terry.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we totally would have watched your student film, but we were busy that day. Appropriately, our executive producers include Josh Hillerup, Oracle of Moody Films that are a meditation on motherhood; Buck Farmer, Oracle of Moody Films that are a meditation on intergenerational trauma; Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Moody Films that are about preserving your identity within a larger culture; Mikhail, Oracle of Moody Films that are about the difficulty of connecting with someone; Jay Widener, Oracle of Moody Films that are about the loneliness of modernity; and the crew of Erebus, Oracle of Musical Rom-Coms. I said in the last episode that I would send out 1-point wonders to any Oracle supporter that had been with us for 6 months. It was pointed out to me that the Patreon said 3. So anyone who joined under the window where it said 3, I'm going to send out those. I'll be reaching out for addresses, and then I am switching it over going forward. Regardless, thank you for support. Additionally, I'd like to thank the rest of our executive producers: Alex, Alexia, Andrews S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsick, Gargle Noir, George Lara, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nabero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout is to Daniel Scribner, who I assume is the son of Charles Scribner, founder of the Scribner Publishing Company in 1846. As I said son, this would likely either make Daniel over 150 years old or Charles Scribner himself over 200 years old, in which case I'm divided over whether or not they are mages, mummies, or vampires. I'm going to say they're vampires of an esoteric bloodline that instead of consuming blood, consumes only the ink from unpublished manuscripts. Maybe they're actually a mummy that gets second from these manuscripts, but there were so many Twilight ripoffs that they think they're vampires now. In either case, thank you. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethePodcast@gmail.com or at magethePodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethePodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethePodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.
Okay, before I get into Auteur Theory, real quick, Terry, every episode of Mage the Podcast, you always never fail to include a bit about cocaine, and I appreciate that because in the spirit of filmmaking, the coked up cinematic experience has generated many inspirational ideas for the table, I feel.
The 11th sphere, yep.
Yeah, definitely. Once you're done with guns, then you can ascend to the real truth.
Exactly. One is the mundane version of forces, the other is the mundane version of time, seemingly.
Oh, there we go.